Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I'm Diane Napper, filling in for Max Reimer, who's off on assignment. This fall, voters in Minneapolis will have 3 ballot questions that they will be responsible for taking action on. So tonight we're going to discuss a couple of them. I'd like to welcome our guests tonight. We have Jan Unstad and Rocky Rockenstein. They are with Charter for Change Minneapolis, and they are specifically part of the group that is working on the government structure amendment. So welcome to you both. Thank you for being here on Republican Roundtable. We're happy to have you. I'd like to start off with just having you tell me a little bit about yourselves and how you got involved in this. Rocky, do you want to get started?
Okay. Well, I go back in Minneapolis politics a long way. I was elected to the city council in 1974 and served 5 terms, or 10 years on the Minneapolis City Council. So I've been involved in Minneapolis city government for a long time. And then I practiced law, mostly land use and environmental law, which kept me again involved with cities and counties and when the projects that they were doing. So I've got a long history of involvement with local government.
Lots of experience. Yep. That's fantastic. Jan, tell us about you.
And I don't have a lot of local experience in government. I've done some political work and some government work, but it's been on the federal side.
Oh, wow.
But I've lived in Minneapolis for the vast majority of my life, and I was frustrated with what I saw in city government, and my choices were either to do something about it or to leave, and I decided to do something about it.
Well, we're glad that you're here doing something about it. We've got some very important topics. So first I want to make it clear to our viewers that your organization is a nonpartisan organization. You are really about educating the voters so that they know when they go to the polls in November what it is they are saying yes or no to. Does that sound fair? Yeah. Okay, great. So, Rocky, let's start with you. Why don't you tell us what a city charter is and what the Charter Commission does?
Okay. In Minnesota, there are 2 types of cities, what they call statutory cities, which operate on the state statutes, and home rule cities, which have a charter that the city itself adopts. And when you have a charter, you're also required to have a charter commission. And this is a group, in the case of Minneapolis, appointed by the chief judge of Hennepin County, whose job it is to try to make sure that the charter functions to help the city function properly. And the reason we have an amendment that in our group we're supporting is that the Charter Commission spent almost 2 years looking at Minneapolis city government, interviewing people in the government, senior advisors, senior people who dealt with it, trying to find out if there were problems that could be solved. And they came up with a serious problem, one that I can attest existed when I was on the city council and hadn't been solved in the meantime. I call it the 14 boss problem. The problem is there's no one elected official in Minneapolis who is charged with implementing what the city is trying to do. The mayor and all 13 council members have their thumb in the pie. And that leads to confusion. It leads to waste. It leads to too much money being spent because there's not clear direction. And that's what the Charter Commission was trying to get at. So what this charter change does, first and foremost, is it makes it clear that the mayor is the chief executive officer, the one who is charged with implementing what the city is trying to do.
Much like we have a president and then we have Congress.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly the same idea, and it's exactly what they do in St. Paul. In St. Paul, the mayor is the chief executive officer, the council is the legislature.
Gotcha.
And that's been interesting to me because I worked closely with people in city government in St. Paul in a past life. And I can't tell you the number of times I heard people say, why is it so much easier to get something done in St. Paul and it's so convoluted in Minneapolis and so many stops and so many divisions and departments to go through. And it didn't mean that St. Paul had someone who could do a decree and it was done, but you knew what lane people were in at least.
So if you imagine yourself having a boss, which most of us have, but imagine having 14 of them.
Yeah.
Exactly.
How could you
Never.
possibly get anything done if you've got 14 different people telling you to do 14 different things,
Well,
right?
imagine if you had 14 people who didn't agree.
Exactly. Right. Yes. They're all telling you
Supposed to
something
implement
different.
something, and
Right.
it's like you walk 10 feet down the hall and someone else says something different. And if you're a staff person, you think, okay, what should I be listening to?
Right. I could see where that is confusing and where that could cause problems. So first, why don't I take a moment here? I'm going to read, this is city question number 1. This is going to be on the ballot in November in Minneapolis. And it's the government structure, executive, mayor, legislative council ballot question. Shall the Minneapolis City Charter be amended to adopt a change in its form of government to an executive, mayor, legislative council structure to shift certain powers to the mayor, consolidating administrative authority over all operating departments under the mayor and eliminating the executive committee? That's a lot of words, and people have the option of choosing yes or no. So Jan, could you tell us a little bit more about why we want to perhaps say yes, perhaps say no?
One thing I think with all the charter amendments is to recognize that the ballot question will need to have you'll need to do some work to figure out what actually is the impact of the ballot question. They're boiled down to short statements, and you will have a lot of information coming at you as to what the impact would be, various ways to interpret it. What this particular question really says is exactly as Rocky was describing, that the council has legislative authority. They still will be, I will still call my council member when I'm irritated about snow plowing or something like that. The constituent services part of it won't change, but the mayor is actually going to be the person who has the department heads reporting to him and will be in charge of implementing the various procedures and structures that the city wants to have take place.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Rocky, can you tell me why might someone vote against this?
Well, it's hard for me to, even having been a city council member and having probably benefited by my ability to try to make policy when I should, or make things happen when I shouldn't have. But I think if you worry about the mayor having too much power, that might be one reason. Or if you worry that somehow this is going to take away your city council members' authority, that's the other. But it's not a question of too much authority, it's a question of aligning the responsibilities with the actual authority. Most people think the mayor, if you talk to them, is the person who is in charge of the city departments. They expect him to do that. Well, they think he has the responsibility, but he doesn't have the authority. So the charter change says you're the chief executive officer, and it also says the mayor appoints all of the city department heads. And at the moment, the only one he appoints directly is the police chief.
Okay.
Every one of the others are recommended by the city council members and the mayor, and then voted on by the council. So that's a change. All of the department heads will be appointed by the mayor, subject to approval by the city council. That's always been the case. So no change there. All appointments now, whether they're made, when they're made by the executive committee, are subject to the city council. The city council keeps its legislative authority, and in fact, it gets an auditing position added to its staff so that it can audit the performance of the departments. If they think something's wrong, just like the state auditor in Minnesota, the auditor can go in, look at the finances, look at the operation, look at the achievements or the failures, and make a report to the city council, who can then adjust the policy, or to the mayor, who can then adjust the way the department is operating.
So there's still plenty of checks and balances that are part of this, even though the mayor has that executive authority.
Yes.
There's still plenty of checks and balances, and the city council still has a voice. They still have still have a lot of say, the same amount of say that they have now, in order to make sure that, because what it comes down to is we've had so much going on this last year and a half, and we all who live here in Minneapolis, we all want the same thing. We want a strong economy. We want safe neighborhoods. We just want it to be a vibrant place like we've known it to be in the past. And so perhaps this structure of government will help make our government run more efficiently and make things better all around for everyone. So that actually brings me back to a point that you made earlier, Rocky, and that has to do with the chief of police. The head of the police department is currently, that's who reports to the mayor directly, and the only one that reports directly to the mayor, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and so that brings us to our second question on the ballot in November, and that's regarding the Department of Public Safety. So this one reads, shall the Minneapolis City Charter be amended to strike and replace the police department with a Department of Public Safety, which could include licensed peace officers, police officers, if necessary, with administrative authority to be consistent with other city departments to fulfill its responsibilities for public safety? Again, a lot of words. But I think this one, I'd like to talk a little bit more about how that one could be impacted by the first question on the ballot. Because we've got a government, if we're going to change the structure of the government, that could definitely affect this Department of Public Safety. So Jan, if you would give us your thoughts on...
I'll start out with a caveat, which is that Charter for Change, the group that we're volunteering with, doesn't have any kind of official opinions on this Second Amendment. So this is Rocky and Jan talking.
Okay. Well,
as opposed to Charter for Change.
Okay, fantastic.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Well, I want to hear what Rocky and Jan have to say.
Rocky, why don't you start with how you think that's going to have an impact?
Well, remember that the changes there are that are visible are the police department is taken out of the charter, and the requirement that there be a certain number of officers in proportion to the population is removed from the charter. A new Department of Public Safety is established. The mayor no longer appoints the police chief because there is no police department. And the 14 bosses appoint the head of this new Department of Public Safety. So, now this is now a personal opinion, I think that just perpetuates the problem, and I'm not personally in favor of eliminating a police department. But your question was, how do the two fit together? Well, the legal standard is if you pass two, the first thing you try to do is fit them together. And only if they don't fit together do you end up in court trying to figure out how to implement them. We think there is a fit, and the fit happens because the other police charter amendment doesn't say anything about who's the chief executive officer. Ours does. So the mayor still becomes, we believe, the chief executive officer. The charter amendment that affects the police department assumes the appointment process that's in the rest of the charter. It assumes that the executive committee will make the appointments, or at least the recommendations. Our amendment wipes out that executive committee and makes the mayor the appointing office. So we think that what would happen is the mayor would then appoint the head of the Department of Public Safety and would be the single chief executive officer for that department. So we believe that even if that Second Amendment passes, you get better government. Because again, one chief executive officer, one appointing authority, not 14 bosses.
And there are cities that have a Department of Public Safety and have a police department as a part of that. Richfield is an example. The same person holds both the position of police chief and director of the Department of Public Safety. So it's not as though those two things are incompatible necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm with Rocky, though. The idea of having a police department, licensed peace officers, which is the important thing in there, if necessary, means that a whole lot of things are not able to happen. You need licensed peace officers, and it's not a guarantee that it would go away, but that if necessary leaves the window for it to go away. You can't sign a warrant unless you're a licensed peace officer. You can't use a weapon if you're not a licensed peace officer, you can't stop someone with licensed sirens, compel someone to stop unless you're a licensed peace officer. There are a number of things in state statute that fall to the purview of licensed peace officers. And so someone is going to need to perform those duties, whether it's members of a Minneapolis police department, if necessary, whether there might be an attempt to have a contract with another department. I mean, it's pretty fuzzy.
So in layman's terms, the licensed peace officer is what most people would refer to as a police officer.
Correct.
Yeah.
They
Okay.
just
Because they've gone through
they use.
correct.
Yeah.
Okay. So they've gone through training.
Yep.
They have a license. They are by state statute allowed to pull you over or
Arrest you.
arrest you.
Yeah.
All of those things.
Minnesota, across the board, if you are going to be what's known as a police officer, you have you have testing, you have training, you have all kinds of things that are done by a state licensing board, and they issue a license to you upon your hiring by a city.
Okay, so that makes
Or
it
county.
that keeps it kind of a level-ish playing field where everyone has to follow the same rules and
Right.
regulations.
Everyone has the exact same basic training.
Right. Okay, that's great. So let's then talk about the if necessary part, because that seems to me that someone gets to then decide if that's even necessary. And what are your thoughts on what that might look like?
Who is that who gets to decide if it's necessary, and how do they decide if it's necessary, and how many might be necessary, and what happens to a labor contract that's already in place if it's only if necessary, and I mean, I've got ands from now till forever.
I think you see why people who've been involved in city government just think that abolishing the police department, and let's be clear here, some of the people who support that amendment favor abolishing the police department. That's their principal reason for advancing this. The if necessary is really a smokescreen. Most of those people want the department gone, and they want as few peace officers around as possible. They have a different vision of policing. And I'm sorry, but again, speaking now as an individual, I want police officers out there. I want some serious reform in the police department so that we don't have a repetition of what we've seen in the past. But reform is very different from completely wiping out the department. And we incidentally, it's another reason we're supporters of our amendment, is we believe if you have one chief executive officer, then reform falls clearly to the mayor. The mayor will be the central person responsible for reform, and if he or she doesn't get it done, the voters know where to make a change. At the moment,
The buck stops there.
yeah, the buck stops.
Right.
At the moment, it stops in 14 different places. And probably the worst example of this was that during the riots, we know of at least 3 city council members who were on the street giving orders to police officers. Only the chief should have the authority to give orders to police officers. And only the mayor should be able to direct the day-to-day operations through the chief of the department. Council members have no business telling a police officer how to perform his or her duty on the street. And that's what's happened. It did happen. We don't have to speculate. It actually happened.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the officer trying to take direction from his lieutenant or his chain of command and then being told by a city council member to do something different? Where's the poor officer at that point?
Yeah,
And my assertion would be that a lot of the change that I think a number of people, including me, want to see in the police department are things that can happen without changing the charter. The city already signed a new contract with mental health professionals to perform some duties in the absence of police officers or alongside police officers. So that can happen with the current structure that we have. They've already banned chokeholds. The city council did. That can happen. There are things that can be done within the current structure. Again, for me, I can't get that if necessary clause out of my mind.
and I would think that given the rise in crime that we've had in Minneapolis in the last year and a half, that certainly most citizens, I think if they understand the language and they understand what it is that you're explaining, that it's not that to get rid of the department means less police officers on the street, which means crime continues to increase. And we can still have a police department and still get things done, especially if we have a different structure from the top down where it's one boss and a legislative body.
And still have those auxiliary services that we're all looking for
Right.
to help with mental health and with homeless and with all sorts of problems that maybe could be better served by having a different kind of response.
Right. And because I don't think most people aren't interested in the mental health of our citizens. We want to make sure that people are taken care of, that when there is a problem that we can address it, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we have to get rid of our police officers who, as you said, by statute have the ability to do certain things that, say, a social worker would not have the ability to do.
And we want people to be safe, and that's
Absolutely.
both the person who might be experiencing a mental health crisis as well as a first responder who deals with that person and the neighborhood around that is watching or living with this in their midst. All of those people have the right to have that taken care of in the best possible way.
That makes sense to me.
I think it's instructive that people of color from the North Side were the ones who filed the lawsuit that said we should have as many police officers as are provided for in the charter, as a minimum. And they won that lawsuit because there is a charter provision that requires a minimum number of officers in relation to our population. I happen to think we need more than that. But that's another thing that worries me about the amendment, question number 2, the amendment about police. It eliminates that floor below which police officers should not fall in the city. And again, I think that illustrates what the true purpose of people behind that amendment is, which is to abolish the police department.
Because it seems to me that if you base it on something like the population, then that's an easy enough number to determine, because you always know what the population is, give or take. But to not have any floor, to not have any idea of how many this body might say we should have, and how would they know exactly?
And again, that's the who decides.
Right.
Who decides? How do they decide?
Where do they go?
I have not found an answer to either of those questions.
Okay.
Well, it's probably the mayor and the city council. One of the council presidents I served with said it's really very simple. City policy is 7 votes with the mayor and 9 votes without the mayor.
Yeah.
And that's, unfortunately, that's where the 14 boss problem comes in. If everybody followed that, then we'd be okay. But that's not what's happening. Council members are trying to direct city departments, many times contrary to the policy that the majority of the council has adopted. That is a recipe for disaster and for all kinds of problems. If the mayor is the chief executive officer and you tell the city engineer, for instance, do this, and it's not city policy, the mayor is going to say to you, I'm very sorry, my city engineer can't do that, and I'm directing him not to do that because that's not city policy. If you want to change that policy, go get 6 other votes, or if I'm opposed to you, not 8 other votes, and you can establish that policy. And that's the way the democratic system is supposed to work. The majority is supposed to, of the city council is supposed to set the policy, and under our charter amendment, the mayor would then implement that policy. And you wouldn't have 14 people telling department heads what to do.
What to do.
One person, the
Right.
mayor, telling them what to do. And I've been through that. I remember that doesn't take power away from the city council. Let me give you an example. When I was on the city council, the police chief decided to wipe out the police officers in the schools program. Well, that was an adopted policy of the city council. So, but the mayor said, no, I'm just going to take them out of the schools. So what he forgot was that we have budget authority. His idea was, I'll take that money and I'll do something else with it. And we adopted a budget amendment which said, here's this, make up a figure, I can't remember it, like $400,000 that's just, that is in the budget. That money can only be used for the police and the schools program. You can't move it somewhere else. City Council has that budget authority. So we have legislative authority, we have budget authority. That's a lot of power.
That is a lot of power.
That's a lot of power.
And
you can use it.
constituent services.
And constituent
which is
services.
incredibly important.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they work for us. Right?
Absolutely.
That's
They're
right.
supposed to
They're
anyway.
supposed to. Yeah. And occasionally, our department heads or their people make a mistake. They want to get it right. You pick up the phone, you call them, you say, you missed the corner of the block on garbage pickup. The next day, they'll be out there picking it up. That's not going to go away.
Yeah.
Some people have argued that is affected by the amendment. No, in fact, the amendment says specifically that council members can still raise questions about constituent services.
Okay.
So there's no question that stays in.
Yep.
That's important. There's so much that I think most people don't really think about in terms of language for our statutes and how it affects them. And so that's why we wanted to have you on tonight to really explain more about what these ballot questions are actually going to do, whether they are passed or not, and what they won't do. So is there anything else that you'd like to add as part of this? Anything else that you'd like to say about the first ballot question, which has to do with the government structure, or how it might affect or not affect the Department of Public Safety?
I think I will reiterate what we said initially, which is voters are going to have to dig in on this. There is going to be a lot of information out there, and we've already seen a number of different groups, some nonpartisan, others less so. There's going to be information flying, and it will be incumbent upon the voters to actually look at the language and get the detail of how this has an impact, and then overlay state statutes that have an underlying, like with peace officers, they control some things, and make sure that you actually know what you're voting on.
Great. Any last thoughts, Rocky?
The city is a $1 billion plus corporation. It needs one executive officer, not 14.
Makes sense to me. All right. Well, we certainly have enjoyed you being here today. We will have more information on our at the end of this video. Viewers, we do have a third ballot question that will also be at the end of the video, and that is regarding regarding rent control. So I think the most important thing is to make sure that you understand what these ballot questions mean. Ask your friends, ask people. As Jan said, there's plenty of information out there. You can go to the Secretary of State's website, the City Clerk's website. And so Jan Unstad and Rocky Rockenstein, thank you once again for being here to talk about the Minneapolis City Charter Amendment. I'm Diane Napper, hosting for Max Reimer on Republican Roundtable. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.